Welcome back. In the Crossfire tonight, Alan St. Pierre and Patrick Kennedy. This week, Colorado became the first state in the nation to legalize marijuana, and thousands of people lined up to buy it. But what about methamphetamine, cocaine, heroin? We need to understand that legalizing marijuana could be a watershed moment. All inhibitions against drug use are going to collapse or certainly dramatically weaken. We could go back to the 1890s when all sorts of dangerous drugs were legal and their use was widespread and out of control. And Alan, I just want to ask you, I mean, from your perspective, not your organization's perspective, but from your personal perspective, what would you do with heroin, cocaine, methamphetamine?
I'm a big supporter of what's known as harm reduction. This notion that if you use or sell or produce these so-called hard drugs, that if you interface with police, you should have an option for treatment. Jail, prison should not be the first immediate consequence.
So-called hard drugs?
Yeah.
What do you mean so-called hard drugs? Meth is not a so-called hard drug.
In my world of drug consumers, there's, for example, there will be people that will take umbrage with the very question being asked that somehow or another there's even a division between marijuana and all these other drugs, which I logically make myself. And here's one reason culturally I'd say to that. You know, there's High Times magazine, there's Cannabis Culture magazine, there's Skunk magazine. First Amendment, we've never seen a heroin magazine or a cocaine magazine. I don't think the culture supports those hard drugs being legalized anytime soon, but I don't think people should be arrested and jailed because they use them.
Now, what about people who, for example, the Mexican drug cartel, which routinely kills people?
Well, of course, violence always warrants the most severe punishments.
Because I mean, there's this interesting challenge. It's almost like the prohibition in the 20s, where we're going to say you're held harmless if you have a small amount, but the person who got it to you, who's also making huge amounts of money right now.
Well, that's why regulation and control largely puts it, much to the chagrin of some, that there will be some corporations and others that are involved in this, but I would argue that is better than the 76 years of prohibition we've had.
Yeah, but you know what would be great is if, like the tobacco industry had to do, for every amount of dollar they spent on advertising, they also had to fund a public health campaign.
Oh, yeah. And by the way, the taxation in Colorado and Washington does fund, like, anti-marijuana education.
Yeah, but I'm making a distinction between the alcohol tax and that's negligible in terms of covering the true cost of the impact of alcohol on our country. Tobacco, same thing, but it was that requirement that for when they used to go on the air and Marlboro Man and everything, they had to put equal time for public health. And of course, you remember those old ads where the person couldn't breathe anymore, that they lost their trachea. When they had to do that, guess what? Show was over. They couldn't advertise anymore. I have a real problem with this thinking that we're going to pay for the problems that marijuana creates simply by this tax.
I think Dennis O'Krent in his book does an excellent job reviewing prohibition, that you don't really pay in a one-to-one binary way for the use of it. But that's not an argument to keep the failed prohibition going. There's other legitimate arguments, health reasons, moral reasons, constitution reasons, economic reasons, why we should end the prohibition.
Let me throw a reason at you. It's very hard to talk about drugs in America without talking about race and the race issue and the disproportionate impact that the drug war has had on communities of color. I want to just show a couple of numbers here, a couple of figures here. Basically, African Americans, white folks use drugs about the same rate, but when you look at the arrest rate, when you look at who actually winds up going to jail, it's astronomically higher for African Americans. Doesn't that bother you? I mean, if you're gonna continue to insist, as you are, that we rely on criminalization, putting people in prison, how do you deal with these kind of numbers?
Well, first of all, that criminal justice system is dysfunctional insofar as it needs a major correction. If we think that we're going to solve it just on the drugs issue, I mean, African Americans, other minorities are sentenced to more time no matter what the crime is. Okay. So let's make to distinguish between this being an issue that's the panacea for all injustice
but let me throw something at you. You're a good liberal. I mean, you're on Newt's side on this thing, which is interesting, but you're a good liberal.
Well, I'm also concerned about the minority community that's now going to be targeted by these marijuana producers, because you look at the alcohol industry in this country, I'll tell you what, more, alcohol distributors are in minority neighborhoods by a factor of 10.
Yeah.
I can't even begin to tell you what the latest numbers are. You're from the West Coast. You know what LA looks like.
Absolutely.
Forget about it. There isn't
right.
an equal, and so they have. It is insidious.
So you're
is
concerned, you're concerned that these for-profit marijuana corporations are going to start preying on these communities. That's a concern I've got. But at the same time, you're talking about spending $7 billion a year enforcing this stuff, locking this stuff up. You're a good liberal. Wouldn't you rather have the $7 billion and the tax money for marijuana do something else?
Listen, we pay fines all the time for things that are against the law. We ought to have this against the law. People ought to pay fines if they do something really wrong. They ought to go to jail. But frankly, the notion that we're going to be selling the stuff at CVS and Walgreens, that the Krogers and Stop and Shop are going to be selling this, ought to frighten all of us.
Tobacco has been mentioned here aptly. In my lifetime, tobacco use has been cut in half. We didn't P-test anybody. We didn't destabilize the borders. We didn't have, in the case of New York City, a 9-to-1 ratio of blacks to whites being arrested, where you and I grew up in Massachusetts, 13-to-1. So
it took a long time.
Yeah, but we can achieve the stated goal without using the brutal criminal justice
Let me ask you a
system.
question. You mentioned P-test. With Colorado legalizing it.
The professorial law professor questions are coming. They're coming.
It's a very straightforward
We're getting them too.
question, which is,
Yeah.
should companies be allowed to test people before they hire them?
Oh, so the law is going to remain the same. It was not impacted. People will try to litigate, I'm sure, from our side, claiming that, like an alcohol user, they shouldn't be. But we're getting those questions now from people who have used marijuana legally on Wednesday and Thursday, gone back to their jobs in Kansas or Wyoming, tested positive for a metabolite. They're not high. They're testing positive for metabolite. So this is truly law professor heaven here we're getting into.
Wait, no, this is serious stuff. This is not law.
I want to know. I want to know that the pilot walking and having seen flight, since this guy's not likely to be Denzel
So drug
Washington.
testing gets you there, but most importantly, before people get on those planes, they should be using impairment testing, computer testing, which we already have for the nuclear silos,
do you
which is
support
good.
the right? Do you support the right of, for example, trucking companies to test truck
Absolutely.
drivers?
So it's a social contract when you work for an employer. If they don't want you to use drugs, then you shouldn't
But
do
here's
them.
the second order problem. As you both agreed, the place most likely to be using is the poorest neighborhoods, which means they get told, you get to buy drugs, but by the way, you're probably not going to get a job.
That's right.
Yeah,
That's a very big problem in poor neighborhoods.
So there's no doubt that testing people, and by the way, this is happening with tobacco too. We now have people being tested for tobacco, even though it's perfectly legal. So it's sort of we made this bed, we might have to live in it regarding drug testing.
Well, look, I am on your side only because I can see no other way out of it. But I am concerned that we are not doing enough to really make sure that if we do it your way, I haven't heard you talking about the need for us to really stigmatize this thing. I haven't heard you talking about the need for us to make sure that we don't have more people addicted. And I'm concerned that there's going to be a victory lap from people like yourself, and people in my community are going to pay the price.
Well, given the opportunity here to talk about it, no doubt that talking about destigmatizing it, I'm not keen on advertising. I don't think we should have TV or radio advertising. There might be direct person-to-person advertising through the internet or through your phone. So we're all for those discussions.
Well, we'll talk about it when we get back. I want you both to stay here. Next, we're going to have the final question for both of our guests. There are some doozies. And we also want you at home to weigh in on today's fireback question. Should marijuana be legal nationwide? Tweet yes or no using #Crossfire. We'll give you the results after this break.